I'm going to now introduce Mark Fenton, who's going to give us a 1-hour presentation, which includes Q&A, by the way, and discussion. Mark is a national public health planning and transportation consultant. He's also an adjunct associate professor at Tufts University, and he's the author of many books, including The Complete Guide to Walking for Health, Weight Loss, and Fitness. He's been a long-time and vocal advocate for non-motorized transportation. And he also consults with communities. He's a frequent consultant on bike and pedestrian plans that fit into a community's comprehensive plan. And he is the former host of PBS's series, America's Walking. Welcome, Mark Fenton.
So, this is my favorite day. I can't believe that it has become my favorite day. I didn't even realize it. First of all, I have a neighbor who's going to be the head of AASHTO, which is a really big deal if you work in the transportation. But more importantly, I'm in a place where the director of transportation, where the local mayor totally get this, where the people from the Department of Transportation that I've worked with before, Bob Smith, where's Bob? He's back there somewhere. So I know he gets this stuff. Gee, it's obvious from the project that you guys are doing, you get it. I met the planning director today and said, director? No, what's your title? Just plan? But you get it in your planning department, clearly. Because most of the time, when I'm doing this work, I know I'm up against somebody. There's somebody who's hating this. Now, you may tell me, well, the downtown businesses have hated this project, or there's always an adversary. Or sometimes it's just the residents at large. We're frightened by the change. It's going to be different, and different is bad, and it's scary. But when you have this kind of a group together, having the kinds of conversation we've already had this afternoon, just starting, it's really good news. And you just said this, Michael, but I had been thinking of before you said, I often hold up Rhode Island as an example. I say, you know, the Rhode Island DOT is doing this. You know, they're adopting these kinds of guidelines as their standards and things like that. People say, but that's Rhode Island. They're tiny. They're the size of one of our counties. Well, I'll say, then do it in one of your counties first. Prove that it works and roll it out statewide. I do not accept that as an answer, because it's really about a philosophical position. What do you believe? Do you believe those words you just said a few minutes ago? If you as a state, a community, a region, a town believe that, you can make that work at any scale. New York City's doing a lot of really amazing stuff. That's the most urban city in the Western Hemisphere, perhaps, and they're doing it, right? Jeanette Sedek-Kahn, their director of transportation, is an innovator on what many of us would call complete streets principles. So I just don't buy the argument, well, it's Rhode Island, they don't count. On the contrary, I see this as a national model. So know that I, who go all over the country talking about this stuff, talk about you guys all the time. In fact, I use some of the photos you'll see here today around the country. A special thanks, by the way, to the planning department. You guys were my hosts today when I was sort of downloading some local photos, giving me some more context. This photo is from that visit where the mayor was here with us. We think 10 years ago. It had to be on the order of, right? 2012, 14, 13, somewhere in there. When we looked at the circulator and you guys were talking about what you were going to do with it. I'm going to talk about much more than that. Indeed, if you'll allow me, if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, I'm going to open with a couple minutes on why the health department's in this conversation and why, indeed, I think they really are helping drive the bus on this conversation nationally. And should be. Okay? It's important context. I also, in doing that, want to give you all ammunition that is hard to push back on. Okay? It is hard to deny the health need, whatever your philosophical position on complete streets and transportation. So I'll do that. But then we have to ask the question, well, if we build it, will they come? If we build these nice bike trails and the bike lanes and all this silliness, are people going to actually get out there and use it? And I'm going to answer that definitively with an evidence-based argument that is yes. Okay, to be very clear, we have evidence. And in fact, again, I'll thank my public health colleagues, because that's where you read a lot of this research. And then I'm even going to answer the question that I will sometimes get, because this is the other pushback you'll sometimes get. This is all well and good, but Mark, we're a capitalist society. If this is what people want, wouldn't the market be directing us there? And I'm going to tell you that it is. That the market is saying this is exactly the style of community design that people want right now. And again, we have evidence. So what I really want to do, you all get it. We're kind of the choir in this room. I hope that I'm adding arrows to your quiver. That's what I want to be doing, including the health arrow. And then let's talk about the example here, and I think some others. I've also worked, so you'll see photos from North and South Kingstown just because they are nearby, and they're also part of this initiative, and I have been fortunate enough to work there. So you'll see some photos mixed in, including, by the way, our very scary walk audit on, I think that's called what's the name? Devil's Foot Road. Devil's Foot Road. Might as well just be called Get Killed as a Pedestrian Road in North Kingstown. So let's start, though, the perspective with this little exercise, if you'll indulge me. Think back, please, to your earliest fond recollection of having been physically active as a youngster. And I really want you to play your memory tapes back as far as you can get. So think back to, some of you have done this with me before, please indulge me. Little kids, you're tiny, not high school sports. Get it in your head. If you have to close your eyes and actually envision yourself as a little kid being active. Got it? If you have an image, turn to the person next to you and share those recollections right now. 10 seconds each. Go. Okay. It would be far more interesting to have continue those conversations and to listen to me for the next 30 minutes, but indulge me if you will. Because there's a method to my madness. There's a reason I had you do that. I want to ask you a series of questions about your recollections. I want you to raise your hand if your answer is affirmative regarding what you recall. So for example, did you recall an activity in which you were only with kids of the same age and gender? Same age and gender, hands up. How many remembered an activity that occurred at a scheduled time and place? Scheduled time and place. How many remember an activity that had to have an adult present to do it? How many remembered an activity that required a uniform that you either bought or received as part of a uniform? No. How many had to have an umpire or a referee present to do the activity? How many remember activities where there were kids of different ages and different genders? So it might have been boys and girls, older and younger, a mix. How many remember activities where there did not have to be an adult present necessarily? How many actually could not have gotten away with what they were doing if an adult had been present and tell the truth? A lot of you, right? Yeah, a lot of us have that. Setting fires out in the woods at your fort or whatever, damming up a neighborhood creek, right? How many had a wheeled vehicle as part of your recollection? A bike, a trike, a scooter, a skateboard that you had built, something with wheels. Okay. How many remember water being part of your recollection? A fish pond, maybe a frozen pond, you're talking about ice rink, playing in the creek, okay. Ocean, clearly, the ocean state, I would hope, the ocean with some recollection. How many of you, if you'll allow me to use the term, remember being to some degree, when you were a little kid, a free-range kid? How many think, yeah, I was kind of a free-range kid? Not a rhetorical question here. Good. Now, last two questions are the order of the day, so listen closely. How many of you believe the majority of children growing up in America today are free-range kids? Be honest. Look around. And last question. How many think it's good for the health of the next generation that they're going to be healthier because they're not free-range kids? Good thing we don't have free-range kids anymore. Hands up for that. Wow. Think about what we just said. As recently as a generation or two ago, we had a lot of free-range kids. Most of us in this room. We don't anymore, and we all agree it's not good for them. To which I ask one thing and one thing only. What are you going to do about it? And it is not a rhetorical question. Anytime I stand before elected and appointed boards in particular, I served 6 years on the planning board in Situate, an elected board. I think the single question we should ask, if we don't ask any other, is what am I going to do about the fact that a generation or two ago we had free-range kids, we're not anymore, we know it's not good for them, what are we going to do about it? That's really at the heart of the conversation, and I'm going to make that argument. By the way, I'm not the only person talking about it. Far smarter people than I. A guy named Richard Louv wrote a book called Last Child in the Woods. He coined the term nature deficit disorder. He talks about all the physiological risks associated with being inactive as a youngster. By the way, he says urban kids, rural kids, all of them used to be free-range. Kids in the city, they had that lot in the neighborhood where they played the pickup game of baseball or stickball in the street, right? Even in the most urban setting, they were outdoors. Not anymore. Shane Gould, a child health advocate in Australia, she spoke up when I was at the Australian National Physical Activity Conference a couple of years ago. She said, I don't think it's just a physical problem. She goes, what about the developmental challenges of kids not being outdoors? She says, where's the inventiveness and creativity of making up games? Where's the leadership skills of picking teams and being a captain? Where are the negotiation skills of dealing with it when there's no grown-up to tell you what to do when the ball goes out? In other words, you, as community leaders, probably started developing those skills when you were 7 years old, right? Being a free-range kid. Kids today, they're in the U12 soccer program. There's a coach telling them when to start, when to finish. They were driven there and driven home from practice. They're in a very homogeneous group of kids, all boys, same age. They don't have to deal with difference, right? Think about it. I mean, it's a really dramatic change. By the way, quick side note, we have to acknowledge this. If you ask parents today, why don't you let your kid walk to school every day from grade 4 on like Mark Fenton did? Why can't your kid disappear on a Saturday morning on his bike with 4 friends and be told to be home when the dinner bell rings or when the street lights come on, right? I mean, literally, some of us had those kind of... You ask a parent why they don't do that, what's their first answer? It's not safe. There are horrible, scary men with big, thick mustaches hiding behind every tree. The mustache men are out there, right? And I don't make light. I mean, I understand. I have a 15-year-old daughter, 17-year-old son. I know there are places they shouldn't go unaccompanied. There are dangerous streets that they shouldn't have crossed at certain ages. I got all that. But you tell me, just so we make sure we're clear on the facts here, what's the actual increase in violent crime against kids by people who don't know them over the last 30 or 40 years? Let's take the time span when the percentage of kids walking and bicycling to school, walking and biking to school went from 40%, the green bar here now, 40% to only about 15%. And the percentage being driven to school by car, not by bus, by car, the red bar, went from 15% to almost 50. So that 30-year time span, what's the increase in violent crime against kids? By the way, one other interesting thing happened over that 30-year time span. Do you know what it is? Childhood obesity rates tripled. Childhood obesity rates tripled as we got in the habit of throwing our kids into the back seat of the car for every trip. That's what we did to them. And the actual increase as a percent across the country is what? Anybody know the number? Increase in violent crime? Zero. Zero increase in violent crime against kids by people who don't know them. There are certainly more single-family homes. There are more custodial battles. There are things that have made the world a different place. Both parents working in the household, right?
When you say violent, what do you mean by violent?
Abductions, you know, sort of, and I'm talking about people who don't know them. Let's make sure we're clear. Now, if you want to quibble about the data, you want to say, yeah, because there's no evidence. At the National Center for Safe Routes to School, we looked really hard at this. Because when we were trying to encourage people to walk to bike in school, that was the first answer parents gave us. It's more dangerous out there. The reality is it's not different than when we were kids. In fact, the biggest difference with the roads, volume and speed of vehicles, size of vehicles, those are much greater differences. And indeed, if you want to talk about what a kid today faces as a real risk, the much higher probability than them being abducted. And I'm not making light. I'm not saying we shouldn't care about that. What I'm saying is we should fix that. If there's a place where a kid can't walk safely on the street because they're either danger from traffic or from crime, we should remedy it. Because what they face is 1 in 3 children born today will end up with type 2 diabetes in their lifetime. A disease that we used to call adult onset diabetes because we thought you could only get it in your 40s or 50s. We did not think physiologically you got it as a child. We're seeing it in 8 and 9-year-olds. So they use the clinical term now, type 2 diabetes. So I'm not making light of real risks out there for kids. I'm saying our job is to fix it, not to throw our hands up in despair and sentence our kids. And by the way, let me add one other thing. I don't think we should even be talking about an obesity epidemic. That's the other, I think, flaw in the public health argument here. First, we forget how young it's reaching. Second, it's the wrong thing to talk about. We should talk about the 2 underlying behaviors that lead to ill health and which are independent risk factors and which, indeed, we can do something about, what I call twin epidemics of physical inactivity and poor nutrition. Because here's what we know. If we can help a person be more physically active and eat a better diet, they'll live a longer, healthier life, even if weight does not change dramatically. So the problem with talking about weight is, then we focus on the individual. You're a bad person, which is not helpful to the conversation at all. Let's instead focus on the behaviors that we collectively as a community can help change: physical inactivity and poor nutrition. Questions on this part of the story? Because this is a kind of, I think, an important starting point of context. Good? Questions? Beth, go.
So given that you have a whole generation of parents who have lots of anxieties about letting their children out of the house, giving them more independence.
Right. You're going to ask me, how do we fix that?
Well, you know, beyond fixing the physical environment,
Yeah.
provide
So,
more.
It'd be fair to say we can't talk about all of it tonight, right? Because we're talking about the physical environment in complete street. I do a lot of work, for example, as an example, let me just give you a flavor. With Safe Routes to School, one of the examples we found very successful in launching what are called walking school buses. The idea of a designated route to school that an adult will walk accompanying a group of kids every day. With a schedule. We did one in my neighborhood. My wife very successfully organized a walking school bus from my neighborhood to the Jenkins School in Scituate. Now the beauty of it was, none of us ever saw, I never saw it as a long-term solution, nor did she. What we really were doing was helping parents bridge the behavioral gap back to a group of neighborhood kids walking with an adult, taking turns on a schedule. Then what happened is we got some sidewalks restriped, we got a mid-block crossing put in place where one was needed near the school with a crossing guard. So we made the environmental changes too, painted some crossings and things like that. And drivers began to expect to see that group of kids walking. The group grew large enough, we started having older kids able to look out for younger kids, and we shifted back the social norm. And I think that this walking school bus was an example of the kind of sociocultural tool that I think goes with the built environment tools that we're talking about today. That's way too short an answer. We could do a 2-day seminar just on what you asked. But is it a fair point to make that there are the environmental, physical environment, as well as the sociocultural environmental issues, and you can't ignore either? Fair? Yeah. Because I think it's the right question. But I will say this. Those behavioral things are never going to be a sufficient intervention for success. We have plenty of reason to believe that alone won't change it. That we need the environmental changes too, or we will always throw our hands up in despair and throw the kid into the backseat of the car. Fair?
Fair, thank you.
Good. It's a good question. I'm going to offer a biased perspective now. I'm only going to talk about the physical activity, not the nutrition side of this equation. It is A, more relevant to our conversation. B, I was a competitive athlete. I actually worked in this field for a long time. I worked at the U.S. Olympic Training Center. I worked for Reebok's Human Performance Lab and exercise science, so I know a lot about exercise and physiology and human response. I did the weirdest event, by the way, in all of track and field. That's why I was at the Olympic Training Center. You tell me, what's the goofiest looking event in track and field? Steeplechase is second, and you're right. Wait a minute. But first is, yes, race walking, and here it is, photographic evidence that I was a race walker a very long time ago. And you know it was a long time ago because we only had black and white photography back then. And the other giveaway is that those shorts were in style back when I was competing, this being the 1928 National Championship. Many people will ask why race walking, and it's obvious when I show you the next slide. Some of my good friends here have seen this before. It's, of course, the huge crowds that showed up at our competition. And this is, in fact, no kidding now, the start of the 1984 Olympic trials. 50-kilometer race walk. That's a 31-mile race. That's the LA Coliseum. Los Angeles hosted the 84 games, so they hosted the 84 trials. They started us at 6 in the morning, like they do the marathon runners. What happens is you start on the track, you go do this loop around the city, then you come back and finish on the track. And when we finished, the stadium was packed, other events were going on, but at 6 a.m. when we started, to avoid the hottest part of the day, you have to look very closely, and you can't see my mom and dad. Right over there. That's really bad. Making that up. So I worked sort of with elite athletes and all that, and for a while we thought it was going to be about sport. Let's just come up with a sporting activity. Cycling class, spinning, running, aerobics, right? That was. But frankly, I can boil the public health challenge down on the physical activity side to 3 numbers, 30, 20, 365. 30, that's the minutes per day we're told every American adult should be physically active. Get about a half an hour a day. We know kids need more like an hour a day. These are minimum recommendations. The other thing we know, by the way, it does not have to be conscious exercise. There is growing and strongly growing evidence that if it's built into your day, so the person who walks 15 minutes to the bus stop in the morning and 15 back in the afternoon accumulates 30 minutes, they're at reduced risk for cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, osteoporosis, the list of diseases associated with sedentary lifestyles. So that's the good news. It doesn't have to be a structured exercise. Here's the bad news. At most, 20% of American adults actually get it. And the 20% is probably an overestimate because it's based on telephone survey data that the Centers for Disease Control collects. And what we know from that is people tend to tell you what they want to hear when they're on the phone with you. So, no, seriously, they do. They tend to say, oh, I exercised 5 times last week. Yes, sir, I did. They also tend to be taller and weigh less when you talk to them on the phone than when you actually measure those things. 365 you would think is what? Unfortunately, you have to add 3 zeros, and it is an estimate of the number of premature deaths every year attributable to physical inactivity and poor nutrition. The only thing that killed more of us in the 2000s, the early 2000s, was tobacco. And here's the scary thing. Tobacco deaths, as we have successfully started to reduce tobacco use in the country, are flattening, while inactivity and poor nutrition deaths continue to rise. So really, in the current look at this data, in all probability, it's the #1 cause of premature death and disability in our society now. Physical inactivity and poor nutrition. So that's kind of the scary context. And just to get back to this notion of sort of the kind of behavioral change approach, why don't we just encourage people to walk and bike more and kids to be outside more? I think it's well illustrated by what I call the stickiness problem. So the last bit of public health data, and then we're out of this. But I think it's important context. Here's a nice little study done. Like I used to be at Brown University, he's now at University of Pittsburgh's Medical Center, John Jakisik, and he was just trying to get people to walk 40 minutes a day in this study. And they had a 6-month intervention where they called them on the phone and sent them email reminders and taught them how to warm up before they did their walk and stretch afterwards and select walking shoes. Kind of all the stuff we do in health promotion, right? Eliza, where's Eliza? I just saw her there a moment ago. So you know, all the stuff we know works, right? They gave them t-shirts and water bottles, because we love giving out t-shirts and water bottles if you turned in your exercise log, right? That's not the interesting question from a public health standpoint, is it? What happened over the 6 months that I'm calling you on the phone? The interesting question is, after I leave you to your own devices, do you continue to increase your exercise? Did it plateau or did it drop off? And here's the interesting thing. Even though at 6 months they measured statistically significant increases in aerobic fitness and decreases in weight, when you left people to their own devices and didn't call them on the phone anymore, didn't have t-shirts and water bottles, no more prizes, that's what happened to their actual physical activity rates. It actually dropped off. If I invert this curve, turn it upside down, I could show you exactly what happens when we do an enhanced police enforcement program on a road for speed, where we put police officers out there with radar guns, right? And as long as the cops are there, we see the speed go down. And everybody gets nervous, and then and everybody changes their behavior, right? And then once the police aren't there writing tickets, really expensive tickets anymore, what happens to the speed on that roadway? Drifts back up. Unless we actually change the engineering on the roadway too, to mimic the change in behavior that we're trying to get through sociocultural or behavioral change. So my point is, you can't just do behavior change alone, it doesn't stick. Questions? And I just know, because this is a good, you asked the right question. Because I, for 20 years, thought that's what we were going to do. All of us in public health thought we were going to just encourage people. Teach them. No, teach them, and they will come.
Okay.
Teach them and they will come. Doesn't happen that way. Go.
Any evidence about speed cameras, you know, that could be there permanently?
Yeah, we don't know yet because they're so new. There's some evidence that there's I've seen at least one study that says there's a lessening effect over time once it's not a surprise, you know, once people know it's there. But if that effect is we're writing fewer tickets, if we're writing fewer tickets but there's better speed adherence, then it's working, I would argue, right? So the drop-off in actual infractions may be an indicator that you're getting people to adhere to the speed that you want, right? Right? So I think the jury's still out on that. But the bottom line is, enforcement alone that is only episodic clearly is not sufficient. Good? All right, so just to close the door on the public health piece of the puzzle, gyms, exercise programs, encouragement, t-shirts and water bottles, all stuff great, not nearly enough. We've got to build an environment where that's not an unusual picture, those people walking through the four corners, literally a block from here. But rather that's the norm, that we see pedestrians out there all the time because the environment is so conducive, right? So that we need the environment as well as behavior change, encouragement, and all the other stuff that goes with that. So that leads to this question: if we build it, will they come? No. You're wrong, I believe. I believe the evidence says yes. And I read the research literature that includes journals like the American Journal of Public Health and the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, where they do pretty rigorous looks at this. And they look at sort of cross-sectional data, they look at pre and post data, so they use natural experiments like there wasn't a trail here before, they built a trail, did it change physical activity rates in that community, things like that. And I'd say the short answer is more yes than no, but go for it.
No, you're probably right, but the fallacy is that designers we were starting in the late 60s and early 70s, thought that by design you could affect social cultural change. But you can't. The two have to go together.
Well, of course. But you're not going to get sociocultural change without the environmental change. You're not going to encourage people. Neighborhood Watch isn't going to make a neighborhood safer without the environmental tools that go with that, I would argue. Walk and bike to school will not get more kids walking and biking to school. I mean, I got the graphs. I got these graphs going to bed, the stickiness problem. So the sociocultural change, I know the behavior change stuff does not work without the environment as well. Do you buy that argument?
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. So, what characterizes a successful environment for the change that we're talking about? I think four things. This is a gross oversimplification of the research literature. I'm putting that out there right now because I can't have everybody start by reading Jane Jacobs and Death and Life of the Great American Cities and carry them all the way through the planning, you know, sort of literature to this moment and have them understand. So I simplify it to four things. These are what I would say characterize the studies that we see. Greater variety of different kinds of uses in close proximity, mix of land use, we call that. Good connecting facilities for physically active transportation, which, by the way, I count as transit as part of that. Transit is part of the active transportation network. The destination, when I get to it, by its design, is designed to reward rather than punish you for showing up without a car. So I've gone from the macro scale, land use, to the corridors, connectivity of the network, to the site design, right, the actual details of the, and last but not least, there has to be a kind of a layer, a feeling of the safety, both safety from crime and safety from, you know, sort of the physical, so the get run over. Both of those have to be there to acknowledge sort of the point I think you were making before. It's got to feel
I
safe.
don't know what
No, I'm sorry. Tell me what did I miss?
I only wanted to know that, you know, you can say violent crime, and,
Yep.
and maybe you're not including something like sexual assault.
Or
You're not
domestic
taking into-
violence.
You're not taking into account how much is recorded
Right,
then
right.
versus now.
Or even
I mean,
exposure data.
Statistics, you know,
Sure. And one could even say exposure data. How many kids are outdoors now versus 30 years
I mean,
ago?
I chose to move to a place where my kids could go out the door and I could say, come
As
home
did
with
I.
dinner.
Yeah.
You know.
Right, exactly. Oh my gosh. Sorry, just ran out of back as I was drinking my water. So, 4 things, and let me just illustrate largely with pictures from this area, from the North and South Kingstown workshop and so on. Land use, what we're talking about is what you would have traditionally seen in a downtown, right? The ability to live, work, shop, play, learn, pray in close proximity. You know, sort of a village center or an urban center, an urban block would have both had those on scale, right? Whatever, and again, back to Jane Jacobs, she would say you'd see that on one block in New York City, and you would say I would have seen it in Apponaug Village 100 years ago, or on whatever the right scale is. Those things together, including, by the way, mixed use. Even in small town America, I can go out to the middle of Iowa, tiny little Four Corners intersection, Main Street, and they've got mixed use, literally retail on the first floor, housing above. Very common on Main Street in small town America. 2, the network of facilities, and not just sidewalks, multi-use trails, bike lanes, pathways, and yes, transit, and let me reiterate it, there is a growing body of research evidence that says when they've objectively measured physical activity, so literally put pedometers or measurement devices on people's hips, regular transit riders get more daily physical activity. Even aside from any conscious sort of, I'm going for a run, I'm doing a workout. Is that surprising to anybody? So the act of walking to the bus, the train, whatever it is, right? Okay, good, the ferry. And we remind ourselves, and I only say this is for sort of when I'm talking particularly to a non-technical audience, people will say, so do you mean we gotta strike bike lanes everywhere? And well, no. For example, the bike network, or the hierarchy, can include you know, just on-street cycling for low-speed, low-volume roads, shared use arrows or sharrows, bike lanes, and indeed multi-use trails. And the reason I showed that picture of the American River Trail in Sacramento, California, it is perhaps the least sexy-looking section of that trail. It's kind of underneath the elevated expressway there, right? And it was also the last 2 miles they finished. It was the hardest section of right-of-way to get. They finally got this corridor here. And I argue it's also the most important 2 miles of that trail. It's the 2 miles that get you from the innermost suburbs to downtown, or the Old Town district of Sacramento, and it adjoins where their transit center is, right? Where both Amtrak and regional light rail and regional transit both come into. And I'd submit to you that although the beautiful 25 miles of the American River Trail along the river, see Great Blue Heron, all that stuff, goes all the way up to Folsom Lake, is wonderful and great for recreational riding, and to see it full on a Saturday morning. This is the section of the trail you'll be seeing used Monday through Friday of people actually commuting to and from work in the downtown or to and from the transit center. That guy right there is one less car up on the I-5 interstate. He's one less car they have to park in downtown Sacramento. His greenhouse gas footprint is much lower, right? His, oh, and by the way, he's getting 30 minutes a day more days of the week, so he's healthier, he makes fewer healthcare claims at work, he costs us less than health insurance. So he's a mega win, even by the way, if you don't use the trail. I would argue you benefit from it if you're pooled in his insurance or if you're competing with him for a parking space in downtown Sacramento. Everybody get that? That's important because if you're going to make the case for a trail and you got the city councilor or the whoever saying, you know, I'd never ride on a trail like that, I'd say to them, you don't have to still benefit from it. And that we know. Third, when I get to the destination, which of those rewards me for showing up as a pedestrian or a bicyclist, you know, versus says you're supposed to show up in your car? And again, I'm not making fun of either of those, but I will say that our zoning ordinance has actually told us to build this. You know, 250-foot setbacks, 7 parking spaces per 1,000 square feet of retail required. You know, I mean, sort of, it was all just built in. No intended evil there. All unintended consequences of what we thought was good zoning and planning. And yet, you know, the historic downtown was actually, the environment was sort of inviting for us to get out and walk. And these are the things that you see in the research literature. Building at the street, parking behind, trees, benches, lightings. I want to say this is an interesting thing. My eyes have been open about these kinds of things. We used to call them amenities or aesthetics. I have a mom who's in her 70s now, and she will tell me, I don't want to walk there because it's going to be pretty hot and there's not a bench to sit along the way. But if there's a bench under a shade tree, that might actually alter her mode choice, right? So they are for her functional attributes, not for anybody. They could be a functional attribute for me or anybody. My point is, I don't like to just think of those as amenities or add-ons if we have the money. They're attributes, functional attributes for the bicyclist, the pedestrian, the physically active user. This, I think, is some downtown bike park. Do you see this bike actually hanging in the tree here? I think that's down near Brown or RISD. Anyway, down in Brooklyn. Now, I want to make a quick point. That's a Walgreens. I take pictures of Walgreens all over the United States. They're kind of an indicator species. Because you can get a Walgreens. And that's one from Portland, Oregon. You'll notice it's pulled up to the street. There was a small parking area, visually screened by that wall and greenery. Pedestrian scales, trees and lighting. There's a bike rack just out of view here. A pedestrian-oriented entrance. In other words, the only entrance doesn't just face a giant parking lot. That's all great, but you would say, Mark, that's Portland, Oregon, which we all know is a communist enclave. It's a bunch of socialists living out there and they can get that stuff. We live in, like, you know, a normal part of America, and we get the standard Walgreens. They wanted the corner lot, they want the big parking lot. It's not entirely standard. There's pedestrian access at the sidewalk. I went down and walked down, but, you know, you can make the case the dominant architectural feature is still the parking lot. And, you know, sort of what happens is when we push back on them, we get stuff like more landscaping and things like that. And I'm not even making light. I hope this is not offensive, right? So you push back and they say, we'll give you trees, we'll give you... I know, I sit on a planning board. I mean, we had this wrestling match with CVS. It's identical. So I know how that stuff works. But here's the point. In Neenah, Wisconsin, because God forbid, by the way, you say no to the Walgreens, we're in a recession, for God's sake. They want to do economic development. We want the dollars. We're not going to say no. And that's what they said in Neenah, Wisconsin. So they got the parking lot that sort of my mom does not want to have to cross as a pedestrian. She's going to say, maybe we should just drive, right? I mean, by its design, right? I would argue the design says that. But Apple, by the way, decidedly not communist enclave. Neenah, Wisconsin is not Madison, middle of the state. We're in Paul Ryan country, so, you know, not a communist enclave. Next town over, Appleton, Wisconsin, also not a communist enclave. Got that one. It's up at the street, nice street, trees, pedestrian scale, much smaller. In fact, they counted a lot of the municipal parking toward their requirement. And in the end, there are things you can do, not least of which have your ordinance say that's what our expectations are. We have a build-to, not a setback line, right? We're going to, and this is going to sound weird. I was actually considered a pro-development guy on my planning board in my town because I actually said, let's talk to the developers and work this out so they can make some money and we can get what we want. As opposed to being the anti-development, no, just no Walgreens, we can't have that. I just said, and I argue that the much more important thing to do is have a conversation with your elected and appointed officials and staff and give them the cover so that when they do what Appleton had to do, which is to say, if you don't give us what you want, you're not getting the permit. They had to actually be able to call Walgreens bluff, right? Because Walgreens will say to you, or any of the big boys, will say, no, that's not our standard. Our standard is the corner. We have the parking lot out in front. We'll give you the landscaping. And if you don't do that, we're walking with our application. Because, you know, West Warwick would like one of these. And so, you know, what does the board do? We need the dollars. So we say, yes, here's your permit. Go. I'm not trying to write the script here. I don't know exactly how it happened. But, and here's the deal. You can't expect staff or your planning commissioners or city council to go stick their necks out alone on this. We got to fill the room at the public hearing with a bunch of people who say, here's what they should say. Hi, Mark Fenton, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity. Mark Fenton, 25 Crescent Ave. I'd like to say that I want to remind the board that although every American adult should get 30 minutes of physical activity a day, fewer than 20% actually do. That leads to 365,000 premature deaths every year in this country. We need to build a Walgreens that my 15-year-old son who doesn't drive yet can walk to, or my 70-year-old mom who doesn't drive anymore could be able to walk to safely to pick up her prescription. I commend the board for requesting that style of design, and I hope you stick to your guns and don't grant the permit unless the applicant gives you that. Thank you very much. See what I just did there? In a minute, right? I just did my entire opening half of my presentation. Okay, not quite. But we need 50 people ready to say that when it comes to the public meeting on the Complete Streets project. Roundabouts, taking parking away, death before taking away parking, right? We need to populate the conversation with people ready to change the entire tone of the discourse. Questions? By the way, when we were in North Kingstown, these are the elaborate, the hard things to do on site design. What are the simple things to do? How about little corner pocket parks? We were walking on Route 1, this is Post Road down in Kingstown, and there's an old historic cemetery. I don't know if you've ever even noticed it there. We noticed it because we were on foot. You drive by it at 50, you'd never even see it. But the point is, we said, you know, what would it take to get the businesses here to just adopt this, improve it a little, help, maybe work with the Historical Society, maybe some benches, and you know, an interpretive sign. It's right there off the highway, Washington Trust, the bank. Landscapes very nicely all around there. Anyway, my point is, you know, an adopt-a-spot is sort of, there's low-hanging fruit. It's not always the million-dollar project. Let's not always think about the giant circulator project. Yeah, we got to do those, but there's much less stuff we can do. And indeed, I would argue, it appears to me you're trying to do it down here in Apponaug, whether it's the revitalization of a historic structure or these sorts of little pockets that already exist if you get out there on foot and see them, right? So I just put that out there as sort of putting scale on this. It's not only the big stuff. Fourth last of my 4 attributes. So I've said mix of land use, continuity of the network, site design, safety. Safety and access, and I mean access in the context of universally accessible design, every age, every ability and physical disability, every income level. The system works for everybody. Indeed, the Department of Public Health in California asked this question of Peter Jacobson, a researcher out there. Don't we run a risk, Pete, that if we start putting more bicyclists and pedestrians out there, they're more physically active, we lower cardiovascular disease risk, but we run more of them over, so that the net public health benefit is nil? Which is a reasonable question. It's actually how public health people think. They say, what's the net benefit to society? So Peter looked at it, and what he found was, looking at both the European and the US data, as you begin to shift and put more bicyclists and pedestrians on the road, fatality and injury rates per kilometer of exposure, whatever tool you use, goes down. Rates go down. And if you ask him what's the arrow of causality, and he says it's probably both. More pedestrians and bicyclists out there means drivers would expect to see them, and indeed the very things you've done to the environment to get them out there. Bike lanes, pedestrian scale signals with countdown timers and auditory signals. You do that stuff, they're more likely to be out there, and that makes them safer. Everybody get that? But it's important to know the evidence is there. So, an example, the very one you gave, it was great that you gave that, Commissioner Lewis. So there's a 4-lane road, this is Urbana, Illinois, but we're getting these pictures all over the country, and indeed, yes, all over Rhode Island, and I'm proud to say Massachusetts. They're being called road diets, but essentially they're lane realignments. We realize the 4-lane roads have all sorts of problems, not least, we see the straddle drivers all the time. Seriously, because if the guy in front of them wants to stop and turn left, they want to go around, and if somebody stops in the right lane to make a right turn, they want to be able to go left. So you get this effect, very unsafe, inefficient. Flows are actually perturbed by that. You get a lot of collisions. You do this, move the turning vehicle out of the lane, and holy cow, you get room for bike lanes and mid-block crossings where they're appropriate, where there are no turning movements. And the engineer here, Jennifer Selby, said we essentially effectively eliminated one entire kind of collision that was very common in this road simply with the redesign. It's gone. You don't get the rear ending of the left turner, and you don't get the person who goes around the left turner and creates a collision in the right lane. Those are just gone from the mix now. We were down in North Kingstown, and this section of Post Route 1 does not carry that much volume. They talked about and were saying they're interested in this lane realignment down there. Does anybody know if that's actually going forward? I mean, that's the plan at least. Bless your souls. Because I know your planner and others in the sort of on the staff said, what, you're saying no? You're getting a head shake?
I don't know. I think they're doing it.
No, nobody's done it yet. I'm saying is that plan, because that section of Route 1 has not been repaved yet, right? Because it is pending for paving. And this actually gets to the other point that you made. We're not going to snap our fingers. Mary said, let's do it on all the roads. But but even more, what I would say is this. Let's be opportunistic. Let's be opportunistic. Whenever we touch a road, let's ask the question, can we make it more complete? So is it inappropriate? When we're out there repaving anyway, so that the marginal cost would be much lower of doing this project, right? The additional cost. You do it when you're out there anyway. So when that section of Route 1 comes up, that's the day to make this change, arguably. Particularly in lean economic times. And then we're back to the yes, so it takes 12 years to get there. Let's hope it's not always 12. Let's hope it depends. So, my gross oversimplification, and acknowledging sort of that it's an imperfect summary, I think these are the big 4 attributes that define those places that we see from the research literature that are ready for the sociocultural change that you want to put in place. That these are the environmental requisites. Mix of land use, connectivity to the network, the site design is rewarding for the non-motorized traveler, and safety and accessibility for everybody. By the way, great website. Where's this research? Is there one place, Mark, I could start looking at this stuff? University of California, San Diego maintains activelivingresearch.org. Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funds that. Great bibliography. You can literally go there and type in trails and physical activity, or pedestrian amenities and housing values. Right? Which in fact leads to the next point. Great, but what about, say it again? Question? Oh, Active Living Research. All one word. activelivingresearch.org. But it begs the question, so who made you like the czar of the world, that you're going to dictate how we build our cities and towns, Fenton? Indeed, shouldn't the marketplace tell us? I mean, the market, people wanted suburbia, right? They wanted cul-de-sacs with no traffic on them and big yards. That's why the market ended up building that. We could debate that for a very long time, because there's a strong case to be made that planning and zoning sent us in those directions. We moved to the edges where the land was cheapest. People moved out there. They didn't necessarily want specifically having to get in their car for every trip. What they wanted was a house I can afford, and that was out in suburbia, right? You can get more house for your dollar. But let's not even get into that debate. Let's instead say that when I studied economics at MIT while I was doing my engineering degree there, one of the first things you learn in your earliest economics class is, yes, the market is an outstanding tool, as long as there aren't external, what are called externalities, or external costs that aren't captured by the market. And when there are, you have to capture those if you want the market to really work well. And good examples of externalities to our transportation decisions are things like the environmental impact. You don't think about and don't actually have to pay for the air quality impacts every time you start your car. Or the safety impacts, the fact that we kill 4,000 pedestrians every year and closer to 40,000 die total in motor vehicle collisions. Every year in the United States, that's a cost we just accept every year, year on year. Or the social costs, the inequity of a transportation system that presumes you can drive a car, right? That assumes that if you don't, you're just sort of out of luck. Or even increasingly our schools recognizing that more physically active kids perform better academically and act out less in the classroom, or let me say the converse, less physically active kids perform less well and act out more in the classroom. Right? That's what the data is starting to show. All of these are costs associated with less daily physical activity, less active travel. But we can go a step further and look at actually what the market is telling us. And we're seeing, for example, higher housing values in communities with higher, quote-unquote, walkability scores. This is a great website. Who's familiar with WalkScore? You guys, everybody write this down if you don't know this. It's a one-word website, WalkScore, all one word, .com. You can put in any address in the United States and get a score from 1 to 100 for the so-called walkability. It's a very imperfect instrument. Because, no, I'm admitting right now, it's not like, but it's better than not having it. And I know that because people go to it all the time, to the extent that real estate companies are now tying to the WalkScore website. They actually link up, so if you're looking for a home, you can plug in and say, well, what's the WalkScore of this house that I'm looking at? Because people are asking for that. Indeed, this publication tells us that the next generation of home buyers, when they did sort of a survey and talked to realtors nationwide, a taste for urban or in-town living, public transportation, they wanted proximity to a park or a trail or a greenway. They want their kid to be able to walk or bike to school. Parents are telling them, and here's the interesting thing. Look at the picture, you guys. That's a woman on a bike with a baguette and sunflowers in the basket. My God, it looks like the Netherlands. It does not look like the United States. And to be critically clear, this is a publication not of the Sierra Club, but of the National Association of Realtors, who are business people who care about selling homes, right? That's what they're, and so my only point is, we have strong evidence the market is getting there. And, you know, you look at mayors like Mayor Avedisian, and it's clear that they are getting that this is an old model. That the kind of the big box store sort of, you know, strip mall model is one that all over the country we've got pictures of underutilized, you know, half-empty strip boxes. I don't know, is this one in pretty good shape? Is the one in the center of the village here sort of fairly robust, high, low vacancy rate and everything?
Low vacancy rate. It's very busy. There's fast food in there, so it's constantly a lot of traffic.
Yeah, good old fast food, count on that. Yeah, that doesn't have anything to do with the health epidemics we face, I'm sure. No, but I only ask because these kind of have a predictable lifespan that within about a decade or so, there tends to start being high turnover, and you know, they have huge environmental impact, all the asphalt, lots of stormwater runoff. I mean, there are lots of issues with this style of design. I mean, I can find all over the country pictures of empty Kmarts that were supplanted by a Walmart that was then later supplanted by a Walmart supercenter. Literally, I mean, I'm not making any of that up, right? We know we sort of parse through these things at about decadal frequency. Which leads us to the closing stretch here. How our community's getting there. So let me make sure, are we comfortable with my arguments so far that we really do face an epidemic of physical inactivity which has meaningful health implications and quality of life implications and cost implications, and that simply telling people to exercise is not going to solve that? We've got 20 years worth of data. I could exhaust you with that. That we really need, at least as a piece of the solution, environmental change to create environments which I call stickier for physical activity. So if you imagine that graph where the behavior change program worked for a while but then it didn't stick, if I can layer on that sticky environment, the environmental change, I've got a better chance of it going like that. And we have evidence that that's the case. So we can look at the differences between the Portland, Oregons, and Boulder, Colorados, Davis, Californias of the world, and sort of the ability to shift mode split. And by the way, for the people who say, you know, that's all great, Mark, but, you know, the Netherlands can do that because it's flat and they don't have winter. In Davis, California, might as well be the Netherlands. It's flat and they don't have winter. To which I say, tell me two of the cities in the United States with the very highest mode shares of bike, walk, and transit use. Not even Boston. Go higher than that. Where did you say? No, U.S. In the U.S. Sorry, U.S. But Oslo, yes, you're right. So go to a cold weather city there. But where in the U.S.?
Minneapolis.
Minneapolis, thank you. You broke the code when she did a cold weather city. Minneapolis, heinous winters. That's in the top 3 regularly. And the other would be Portland, which is anything but flat and very rainy, by the way. So you cannot tell me it can't happen in the United States because it's not flat enough and we don't have rain and we have winters. Okay, so I just wanted to make sure we're good. And you're right about Oslo, by the way. It is one of the good international models. Same. All right, so how are we getting there? I wrote this paper. It was an invited review paper for a journal called Childhood Obesity. I wish it was Childhood Physical Activity and Nutrition, but I don't get to call those shots. But that's what I wrote about. I wrote about community design and policies for free-range kids, and I made the argument that we do know at least what the environmental piece of the puzzle ought to look like. And I think these are the 5 initiatives we see in the successful communities around the country. So if you say, what characterizes the Portlands and the Boulders, but now the Columbia, Missouris, and the Burlington, Vermonts? In other words, it's not just the usual suspects anymore. These 5 things. What they're doing with their planning and zoning, complete streets, transportation trail networks that are transportation-oriented, not just recreation. The 5th one is really transportation demand management. It's policies to support bike and transit use. And comprehensive safe routes to school, which is really just a sub-piece of TDM, transportation demand management, but it's focused on kids, shifting child behavior for transportation. So those are the big 5, and that article is available online at their website, the website for childhood obesity, if that interests you at all. But an example, in the planning and zoning world, I was just so delighted to learn of the transit-oriented development and the fact that you have the ordinance in place. You're not just marketing and saying, come, build near our train station, we're making the thing. No, the zoning ordinance says multi-story, mixed-use, retail first floor. We're going to change our parking requirements, because if we're going to have a lot of residential on site, not every one of those households needs to be a 2-car household, because you can walk to a lot of what you need and you can step on a train. And, you know, I mean, the takeaway for me was, this word right up here, advantages within walking distance. Yes, you're going to take a shuttle right to TF Green. I mean, I should live here for the amount I'm traveling, because A, Green is a much easier airport than Logan, trust me, and being within walking distance, that's the pitch. That's the pitch. Yeah. I'll be, and then I could be a poster child. Yeah, and we'll even say, mustache not required. You know, you can, regular people can live here too. But, you know, sort of so brilliant, but it's not just the marketing package. The ordinance has to be there so the developer, you make the easy path to development this, right? Yes. But other examples. So we were down in North Kingstown, North Kingstown, right? They've got Whitford Junction, giant parking structure at the MBTA station. That's great, but man, I would have loved that to have instead been a mixed-use, residential, retail.
Actually, there's a lot of room there. We can shift some of those into lofts.
That's what I wanted to hear! That's the way to think! Because that can be retrofit over time. And there's a lot of residential across the street. By the way, that stuff's happening, right? So as the demand shifts and once oil gets to $200 a barrel, you know, that's exactly what will happen, and naturally. And you're not entirely kidding, are you?
Not entirely.
Yeah. You heard it here, ladies and gentlemen. Director of Transportation. Yeah, Bruce, relax. We're talking concepts here. No, but you know, Quonset Village, the reason I mention that's that classic sort of big boxy mall that was supposed to be mixed use. The other part hasn't happened yet. I mean, I think they were doing construction right at the worst part of the recession, so they got hammered by all that. But let me say this. This is a big box mall in Winter Park, Florida, that effectively had gotten so bad economically and wasn't making enough money, they just started tearing up parking lot. They had to do all of this as a special use district. Tore up parking lot, did facing sets of buildings, multi-story, put residential above retail and offices. So in other words, they turned what was into a big box mall into essentially a village center. They created the mixed use on what were once the giant parking lot. In part because they reduced the parking requirements, because if you could live there, you could walk to 80% of what you needed. And then they made it a transit hub. Okay, so you guys get the idea. But the point is, yes, we have economic models of those. Winter Park, exclusive, big money, so, you know, sort of it's easy to do it in those places first, but what we have to do is establish viability and then get the developers to play. Comprehensive trail networks. I'm jumping to that just because I want to remind you there are studies that tell us, I think, 3 things. If you look at the research, a nice study by the Robert Wood Johnson, funded by Robert Wood Johnson, sort of said this. If you say, what are the most used sections of trails? Even if you look at some of the classic long distance trails, so the Lakeshore Trail in Chicago, the White Rock Trail in Dallas, the LA to Long Beach Bike Trail down there. What they found was the most used sections, the trail connected to the other elements of the transportation system. So you could get to it from a transit stop, from a bike lane, from a sidewalk. You didn't have to drive your car and park at a trailhead. It's not all about automobile-oriented trailheads. 2, the trails actually got you to destinations, schools, shopping, playgrounds, parks. None of this is shocking, I heard. And 3, I'm sure it's not shocking to you. The third element is that the trails were really woven into the fabric of the community. They were not an escape from it, nearly so much as woven into the fabric of the community, which the authors asserted made them feel safer, right? Because if the trail is where people are, then it's not a scary place in the middle of nowhere, right? So those are sort of the kinds of things we see. So what I have here is a picture of Yuck, the park and ride over by the, you know, the I-95 interchange, but I'm saying maybe that's an important trail destination. Why should I have to drive my car to get on the bus? I should be able to walk or ride a bike to that, and there should be a nice big bike parking structure there, right? We could start with a small shelter that can house 20 bikes, and someday we'll look like the Netherlands, and there'll be a bike garage there that'll park 3,000 bicycles, which is no exaggeration. You can find that in Amsterdam. A 3,000 bike parking garage at a transit station. And if anybody can do it, Rhode Island can. You guys can start, because your trail network's already pretty impressive. I mean, I'm not kidding when I say that. You guys have got a lot of trail continuity. And I was formerly on the board of the East Coast Greenway Alliance. Look at Sue. Sue, where are you? There she is, my dear. And so, you know, I know about the Great Trail and Greenway. Last but not least, I just want to point out that we were talking about institutionalization of transit as a piece of the system. So that's the transportation demand management piece of the puzzle. And I just want to say the really clever stuff is the stuff like when universities and worksite wellness programs say, we're going to pay a fixed fee to the transit authority so that your ID acts as a transit pass. So there's no barrier to use. And we talked about that when we were in North Kingstown about the URI students. I don't know if they have that access now. Do they?
No, not in Providence.
No.
And if I can related question here. 15 years ago, when I was on the board of the Transit Authority, we were told that more than 95% of the parking in Rhode Island is free of where people actually go. And that includes downtown Providence or our university.
Yep.
So, to what extent are you familiar, or is there literature on how free parking motivates people?
Yeah. So there's a great book, if you wanted to start, you know this was the setup. So a guy named Donald Shoup, here comes the spike, he says it, I spike. So Shoup is the last name, write this down, S-H-O-U-P-E, if this interests you, because in one place, you just go on, in fact, you could, don't even read the whole book, go to the journal Planning and read a couple of the articles that he's done over the last 5 or 8 years. There's a 2008 one, I think, that's pretty good. But Donald Shoup has done exactly that. He's studied, one of the books is titled The High Cost of Free Parking, I think, or something like that. But this guy's an economist, man. He's running the numbers. This is not some altruistic, touchy-feely, greeny, I've got an agenda. He just looks at the data and he says, effectively, cities and towns are massively subsidizing automobile use every time we give away a free parking space. Because that land has some value, right? I could do something else with that land. I could be gaining a rent off of it. I could be, getting sales tax if it were a retail property. I could have property income. So anyway, the point is, if you just associate those numbers and look at the subsidy of the automobile, you begin to understand why people drive instead of take transit, because it's massively subsidized. So that's a gross, sort of way unfair, short version of the story. But what I have found, here's what's the takeaway? The takeaway is the communities that are being successful here are gradually moving back toward market-basing their market pricing parking. And they don't do it instantly. You can't just tomorrow say, now we're going to charge what parking costs. That free parking space in the parking garage will now cost you $45 a day, like downtown Boston or whatever it is. You don't just do that, right? What you do is you provide all the alternatives too. You have to create the network and the system, the alternatives, and the incentives, and even do the programs and encouragement, all of education, and then start, working the price back up to where it should be. Questions? Thoughts? Good answer? Thank you for the setup.
But I would think that that also affects businesses as well, because I know that the
Sure.
Providence Place Mall used to charge much more for parking,
Yep.
and now they've reduced it, you can park for $3
Right.
for $1
Right.
in order to entice
Right.
people to go to the mall.
So
Spend
there's
money.
all sorts of, we could do a two-day seminar on this. And the really intelligent stuff is now they're congestion pricing parking. So when it's in high demand, you pay more, and when it's lower demand, you pay less. And you do intelligent systems that tell people where parking is available, and more distant parking costs less. So now, I win, because now they also get some physical activity if they park at the park. So we talked about that at URI. Why aren't you having some of these giant satellite lights lots out by the football stadium or whatever? Make that really low-cost parking, and then those students run the shuttle out there, let those students walk and bike. So yes, there are sophisticated tools, and it's not just charge for parking or don't charge for parking. That's much too sort of simplistic a picture of it. Fair? Yeah. And so you don't just say, well, the businesses were struggling, now I'm going to give them free parking. Look at the total model and the course over time. All right. There is a movement, I'm closing in on the final points here, called Bike-Friendly Communities, an award program maintained by the League of American Bicyclists. And you guys, who knows about this? Anybody familiar? And who's actually gotten ratings? Any communities in Rhode Island have ratings? I know they do.
Rhode Island
I've
does not
looked.
have one.
None? You have 0? All right.
There's only 2 states in the country that don't have it.
And you're one of the 2.
But we're working on it.
Good. Where are you thinking? Where are you going to submit? Newport. Good. And you should do another one too. At least somebody else. In fact, after this project, Warwick could go after one. So there are a series of things: having a plan, bike parking, actually creating bike facilities, maps and wayfinding, bike sharing programs. But the point is, League of American Bicyclists. And if you submit, you can get anything from an honorable mention to silver, bronze, gold, platinum ratings. And if you don't get anything, you at least get feedback that says, here's what you could, if you did this, you could get to honorable mention. If you get an honorable mention, if you just did this, do some bike education in your schools, then you'll get up to bronze, right? So that's what it's intended. It's intended to be an ascending program. Absolutely, you should be doing this. I think there are a number of communities actually in Rhode Island that could.
Providence.
Yeah, Providence absolutely should, for sure. Yeah, Providence should do one tomorrow. Okay. I skipped over Complete Streets home stretch. This baby is at the heart of it. I do not talk to a community in the country, state, any level, and where MPO, whatever, that I don't say, even if you've adopted a Complete Streets policy, I guarantee you're not done yet. Because for the most part, we're not done. That's my observation on the country. So you guys know the premise. All users, all ages, all abilities, all income levels accommodated every time we touch a road. Doesn't mean you strike a bike lane everywhere. It asks the question, what's the context, what are the surrounding land uses, what are the potential users, and what works for them. And it does say we can't just stay stuck in the old arterial collector local sort of hierarchy. We have to think differently, which is what context-sensitive design really says to do. Think more broadly. And it also says you don't let the 85th percentile dictate what the posted speed is. You say we have an intended speed because of the surrounding land uses, and we designed to that speed. Those are some fundamentals. And in as much as people, the first pushback we tend to get in communities that are resistant is, well, it's going to cost a lot. Doesn't it cost more to build a street as a complete street? First, I do not accept that as fact, because it doesn't always, particularly if we do it from the beginning. So I think Mayor Avedisian made that comment. He says, if we get in early, no, you did it. You said if we get in early and begin the conversation, it doesn't necessarily have to cost more. Would that be fair? As long as it's when we have to retrofit stuff and we say, oh, we forgot the bike lane, we got to buy more right of way. Well, of course, you're going to hose yourself. So you don't do it that way. You think about all users from the beginning. And then there are a host of other costs, I should say benefits, to balance any real costs. Because there will be times there are real costs associated. But if we reduce collisions, if we have, and therefore fewer emergency responses, if we have more kids walking and cycling to school, if employers are healthier, I mean, those are not in the same realm as our transportation analysis. Although increasingly, we in health are doing what are called health impact analyses and putting numbers to these and able to, in fact, we did just that on the MBTA's transit, sort of the increases in fare that they did just last year. the Regional Planning Authority did a very compelling health impact analysis that if you looked at those numbers, you'd say there's no way it's worth these fare increases given the costs we're going to pay with reduced physical activity and the health costs associated with that. As well as lost time and some other stuff, you know, because you're putting more traffic on the road if you reduce transit use and so on. So here's how I'm seeing communities move through this successfully. If you were to ask Mark, okay, so what do communities do? First phase is to just state it. Sometimes it's as soft as a whereas, be it resolved sort of policy statement by a mayor or a city council or some other governing entity. Whereas public health, physical activity, blah, 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 the environment, transportation efficiency, be it resolved, we will always take into account all four uses. That is nice, it sets a tone, it's not a complete street policy. Second is when the Public Works Department says, we also adopt the notion of thinking of all four user groups on every project. It's nice, but until the actual guidelines are changed, the actual, literally, the book says, yes, in speeds, and roads with low enough speeds and volumes, you can go down to 10-foot lanes. 10-foot lanes are not the end of the planet, right? And it's not, and when it's in the book, that's when you're allowed to do it, right? And you know, you need that. The example I have to give, can I type just a Fenton story? Who remembers the original Pirates of the Caribbean movie? You guys remember Pirates of the Caribbean with Johnny Depp? So there's a scene where we learn that if you say parlay to the pirates, they can't just run you through or walk you off the plane because you have something to offer and they have to negotiate with you. And the woman in the movie does this a couple of times to the mean pirate until the third time she does it, she says, parlay. And she says, you're walking the plank anyway. And she says, no, I said parlay. What about the code? Remember there was the pirate's code that said that, you know, if I say parlay, you have to negotiate. And he goes, it's not so much a code as a set of guidelines, eh? And he quotes her on the thing. It's got to be written into the code. It's got to be in the ordinance. Pirate's code, remember that. Come back to you. Even then you're not done because I think the only day we really got this, because I'm back to the notion we can't do all the roads at once. The only way we're really going to get this job done is if we're opportunistic. And even when we're just out doing routine painting and paving and digging up a road for the sewer to do utility work, every time we put it back down, every time we touch the road, we're asking the question, can I make it more complete? Because sometimes it's going to be taking 12-foot travel lanes, getting them down to 10.5, and that extra 1.5, we can say, wow, my 3-foot shoulder went to 4.5. It's not quite a bike lane, but I feel more comfortable. Or you know, it's going to allow me to change the geometry here, and I'm going to use shared use arrows. I'm going to make it a share road. I mean, those are the kinds of things that can sometimes happen at modest cost through opportunistic improvement. Questions on that? Because that's subtle but important.
What we run into in South Kingstown quite a bit is there, a lot of the main roads are state roads. So.
And that commissioner guy, man, he is so tough, right?
No, but
it's
just,
hard.
where does that go?
Well, this is exactly, so the document I was holding up was designing a walkable urban thoroughfares, a context-sensitive approach, ITE recommended practice. So this is like one of the manuals that you use now, right? Gee, and I don't want to overstate this.
Yeah, we use it, but our biggest challenge is in most urban areas, there are too many building structures very close to the
So you're stuck with your right-of-way.
So even though, just what you just said, we practice that as much as possible.
Yep.
Try to minimize the travel lane widths from
Yep.
12, which is the standard ways,
Yeah.
maybe like 10.
Yeah.
And try to adapt this
There it is.
principle. But the challenge, of course, is
Sometimes you just
if
have
you
only
are
so much
designing-
right-of-way.
If you are designing a new roadway or
Yes.
a new alignment, this is very easy. It's
Yeah.
very simple.
Yeah.
The challenge,
Yeah.
like I said, is
The existing
take this road, for example, in front of the city.
Yeah. Let's take this road in front of City Hall. So here's South Kingstown. So let's keep in mind that some of the ideas we threw out in that workshop, you guys maybe remember if you were there, we made a human curb extension in front of, so this doesn't change changing lane. In fact, that guy's not supposed to be allowed to park there or there anyway. So a curb extension that eliminated, you know, actually enforced the parking that's already there. That's the ordinance. You shouldn't be allowed to park that close to the trail crossing. So you could create a curb extension, by the way, with planters. That could be done with concrete planters. Who was with us on the walk over there? And so you guys, right, we did that, remember we made the human curb extension, but it wouldn't have to be during a major road resurfacing project. You could now, if you got the DOT to say yes, if only we knew some people at the DOT who we could have a conversation with about this. As an experiment, could we create curb extensions at that trail crossing, temporary ones, have you tried this conversation
I
already?
had this conversation on Main Street last week.
Okay, so I'm having it again right now. So my friend Bob Stearns, famous trail builder in Colorado, who built some of the best, he says, until you've heard no 7 times, you haven't heard no. How many no's have you gotten so far on this?
I
Like
don't
10?
count.
12? Yeah, good. You're not counting. I love that. She says, I don't care what the number. But this is an example. So let's keep banging away at it, because that's a good example where it's not about the lane width, but or you know, sort of the really wild stuff. Remember we talked about how about a mini circle here, or how about when is this High Street? Yeah, because Town Hall is just down the road here, right in front of the elementary school. You know, maybe even just a surface difference here. Anyway, those are the kind of wild ideas. Of course they're hard, they're scary, you just keep banging away at them. And we have forums like this, so that maybe he talks to the guy who's the project guy over there, says, you know, these people aren't bad people. Maybe you should talk to them about this. You know, some of these ideas aren't that crazy. And then if the director's here, he says, you know, maybe the South Kingston stuff, if they're going to be responsible and do the hard work and help us with the public meetings, quite frankly, no, seriously, this.
We're doing a big improvement right where that human bump out is. We're installing a comfort station, and that's
On the
coming
trail.
in- Yeah, that's
Right
coming
there.
in this summer and fall. So
And we saw it.
What's
So
that?
here's the deal. Here's the deal. With the businesses, just quick side note, businesses ticked off at the prospect of doing this because they'll effectively lose a parking space. I mean, it's not a legal parking space, but okay. So they're on board with you.
the Merchants Association.
Oh, bring them into the conversation. They gotta be. They're way more important than some wacky bike advocate. Seriously, business people, they matter. So you're even nodding your head, please. Yeah. Please.
So I get very frustrated because very often it's like you're going down a sidewalk and right at the corner where there's a curb cut, there is a pole.
Right. Or a signal
If
box.
there's a curb cut. But
If there's a curb cut.
So
Good point.
it just, because there are so many parties involved
Such a
with
good point.
making that decision about the sidewalk. So after the sidewalk was painted and the curb cut was put in, and, you know, check
Right.
that was done. But then the telephone pole got
A
put.
different entity entirely. The utility group or the signal group. It's a great example. Some of that has to do with, or a no parking sign. Sometimes that has to do with organizational structure. So I've seen some places where if the project manager is sort of the god of the thing, he or she gets a chance to sort of see all that and has to check off on anything like that. So sometimes that's organizational. You might be able to speak to sort of how that happens in the Rhode Island DOT. Because in others where the silos are really separate, here's the signal group, here's the sign group, here's the, do you know what I mean? They literally don't even talk to each other, and they do happen at different points in time. Like you said, we built the sidewalk, we put in the ramp. Later, the sign got put in, went right in the middle of the ramp. And I know you're not exaggerating, I've seen it too. So, Bob, yeah,
We're going
comment.
to talk about a little bit of this after the presentation and the walk. I mean, it's
Good. As we talk about specific
I'm running out of things to
implementation.
say as you keep giving examples.
No, it's good, it's good, it's good. No, that's great.
These
Let's-
are issues that happen all the time, and for getting everybody on the same page. I don't want to give away too much of the spiel that I have, but the whole complete streets thing is a mindset
Right.
among our designers and all of these other entities like utility companies and
Yeah.
cities and towns. You'd be surprised how many cities and towns have the opposite and go, well, gee, our same project manager went up to Chepachet where we tried to do a bump out and we almost ran out of town on a parade. I mean,
Right.
so
Right.
you go to one community and you're asking you why you're not doing something and you're only doing this, and you go to propose the same thing,
Right.
so everyone is learning at different rates
Right.
and really have.
And indeed, part of our job is to be the emissaries to change those conversations. I mean, one of the most valuable things we can do is be those voices of reason in communities, not froth at the mouth, pound the table, sound like rational, calm people, respect the jobs of the engineer and the planner, and because those are hard things they're all doing. Because remember, the first time somebody comes up to a signal light, we were having this conversation before, and has to like sit through 2 light cycles to make a left turn, you know who's going to get the phone call? Not the bike advocate that got that light signal phasing change so that the pedestrian crossing was longer. It's going to be the Public Works Department. And if they're the caller, Mr. NIMBY, not even NIMBYs, you guys know what NIMBYs are, not in my backyard. You know what the caveman is? He's the citizen against virtually everything. And he's gonna call on it. So he had to sit through 2 light cycles for a left turn. He's gonna call Public Works. He's not gonna be satisfied with the answer. He's gonna call the mayor, and the mayor's gonna go to the Public Works director. Why am I getting this phone call? Your job is to make sure I don't get this phone call. Take care of that guy. I do not want to hear from Caveman, right? Who shows up at every planning board meeting and every city council meeting. So my only point, I'm not trying to, but you're hearing my inner engineer. We got to all own the change, and then we got to get it so that that voice is this tiny little voice drowned out by all the rational people who say, of course we want that bump out at that trail crossing, as an example.
And then, I mean, I live in the Jewelry District now, and there's this amazing opportunity for this redevelopment that's going on there. But I know for a fact, because I went to the seminar that was sponsored by this organization, and you had the wonderful speaker who came and talked about the efficacy of trams and all the, all how this really works. And then that afternoon, I went to hear the development of the Jewelry District. And all this guy was talking about, he's in charge of the czar, all he's talking about is we've got to build more parking structure. We need more parking.
It's all about the parking.
It's all about the cars, cars.
So we have to change this
conversation. He obviously wasn't even there in the morning to hear that presentation. And you know what? I say the state needs to step in and have a conversation with them, not me. I mean, I'll do it, but I think in a situation like this,
I'm going to make the case it's got to be everybody. It's got to be you and the state and merchants and, you know what I mean? I think that's how this stuff changes. There it is.
I'm going to actually say that I think I know the situation you're talking about, and from what I've heard is that they are much more receptive now to the idea of transit in that district. So I think that there's been a lot of people talking about it.
So they've heard.
That message has come through.
Well, also, they wanted more structured parking to get away, to draw people there, and also to get away from
surface. Lots of surface.
So I have, can I interrupt for a second? Because I have the very difficult task of making sure that we stay on time.
Good.
And I know that there's going to be a lot of
questions, and we can let's do this. Let me make a final point, just to stimulate your brains for the walk. We'll go on the walk, a lot of time to chat on the walk in after because it's built in. So, and we don't want to, so here's my wild idea for Post Road. So there's Post Road, it's going to be a one-way in this model, right? You know, so here's this is, by the way, this picture is from a 2007 public meeting, notice. But it's really interesting just to see, and a lot of pieces have been retained, you know, sort of some of the concept of the roundabouts, the realignment over here. Anyway, but the real point is sort of does this become a one-way or not? Mary's got a real bee in her bonnet about this really shouldn't go to one way. This is the chance to turn it to two. Although I get the problem here. You've got it's narrow and things like that, and it's going to be a much lower volume. But here's one wild idea for what you can do on that section of the corridor, because right now if I'm not mistaken, the drawing you showed me showed a travel lane and a bike lane eastbound, right, and then 2 lanes of parking. Interestingly enough, how could we increase the marginal utility of bicycling? Because that's what I want to do. I want to make this a bike pedestrian corridor while maintaining that bottom. Here's a crazy idea. Totally insane. Not totally, completely impossible. What if you made one travel lane eastbound, made this a parking lane, and had a counterflow bike lane on the other side here? Obviously, you might need some structural separation here. Have you ever heard of a counterflow bike lane? So if you have a one-way road this way, you allow oncoming traffic, but it's only bike traffic. So it's called a counterflow bicycle. But Cambridge has a number of them. I'm sorry to have said it because it's a communist enclave. See, now you blew my cover. But I've seen them in other places too. Now I'm seeing them applied elsewhere. Here's the interesting thing. You can't put a counterflow bike lane with the parked cars still going eastbound. In other words, if you have east-facing cars in this parking lane, you're saying, why don't you go bike lane here, parking lane here? But the problem is, then you'd have bikes coming again, at some point cars are moving through a counterflow bike lane. So you'd really have to put the counterflow bike lane over here, but you could do it, and then sharrow this, because I gotta tell you, with the roundabouts here and here, you really traffic calm this road. You've got curb extensions out along the way here. I think this is not gonna be a high-speed street in the redesign. So I think it's reasonable to have the bikes share a shared lane eastbound, counterflow bike lane here, It's a wacky idea.
Are you keeping two, I just heard.
No,
like-
one traveling, stop, I'm gonna say it,
Make my plug for two.
Yes, you
two-way
can,
traffic.
go ahead,
I
Major.
just can't resist the sun. Before we go out there.
No, do it while we're out there looking at it.
I won't be able to be heard because you have an enormous noise of
The traffic.
high-speed traffic out there now with 2 lanes going about 35 or 40 miles an hour, way too fast. Yes, this, whatever you do is gonna slow the traffic, but I just think you have accessibility issues, if you keep it one way, people are.
Still going by and coming around, missing the turn like I did today, I hate it, I did, no, I completely agree. I get it, it's very, totally reasonable.
There's an enormous amount of space on the 4-lane Memorial Parkway, is it called? The bikes go that way.
Okay, so let's have this conversation, we'll be able to talk more about it. I wanted to just plant a different idea, not speaking on the merit. Because I think that there are a range of tools. This is one that surprisingly I think fits into the existing plan quite plausibly. I think it fits into the existing geometry. So I just throw it out there for your consideration. And it's not as, because it might be more about where the paint ends up than anything else in this. Because you're going to do a parking lane, you're going to do a bike lane anyway. It's just sort of how you arrange it and whether you do a shared use lane in the eastbound direction. And I totally get the whole one way, you shoot by it and everything else.
Are these still 2 lanes of one-way
No.
traffic?
One way this way, that's a parking lane now. In other words, I was saying, because if you're keeping 2 lanes of parking, because that's the model right now, right? Two lanes of parking, which if this is going to become a revitalized business district, I understand the intent. I mean, there's other wacky stuff.
Make it 2 lanes, one each way, and just give up 1 lane of parking.
You could do that, and I get, my suspicion is you get pushback from the businesses. I suspect. I'm just anticipating, sort of, I've been in those kinds of
It's
conversations.
better for business to have 2-lane traffic. You can find your store much.
Sure.
All right, I have one question.
I'm by it.
One question. Are you going to lead us on a speed walking?
No. Well, there's a picture of a lane behind parking in York, Pennsylvania. There's diagonal parking. So it's a nice, diagonal parking would be an option too. That would be really wild. So take away your one side parking, go to diagonal parking.
There you go.
And by the way, it's got to be reverse diagonal. If you're doing diagonal parking, do pull past and back in. And my real point in showing this was not to open this debate nearly so much as to suggest creativity in the problem solving and looking at communities that have already done this stuff. And don't underestimate the value of bike traffic along the corridor like this. I mean, I think the businesses are going to benefit from bicycles. Oh, green bike lanes. They're in the MUTCD now, right? You can do them. They might be, if you're going to do a counterflow lane, that might be the kind of a place for a green bike lane to really make clear what's going on. If you were ever going to do, and they, you know how they're using the green now, G, is occasional. You don't strike the whole thing, but you do at the high conflict points, you'll green out the bike lane. So I'm just throwing these, the real reason I threw these photos in that little thing in was to give a sense of sort of, I think the level of creativity we're seeing in design that's out there to sort of navigate these challenging waters, as illustrated by Mary's vehemence, her position. I get all the challenges, but I guarantee you the business owners would be equally vehement about losing parking. So I understand all of that. I'm not taking a position that's counter to yours nearly so much as saying creative solutions, a lot of tools in the toolkit, and in cases where it's paint, it really opens a lot of doors because it's not something that you have to live with forever necessarily. The big decisions you're making, the roundabouts, the key intersections, are the 50-year decisions, and you're doing the right stuff on that, on this project, as I see
So
it.
the point of this walk, is there a set design already for the village, or is this group looking at ideas to contribute?
I think this design is pretty far along, isn't it? Are you like? Yeah, so this design is pretty complete. Yeah, they're going to put an RFP out in June or July or whenever, this year, this summer.
Trying to push the button.
So are we going to hear about some of the complete streets components that are brought into this new design?
And these guys will really do that. And I want to do on the walk, right now, let's go and do this. Let's demonstrate what we do on walk audits, because what I would really love is you to take this tool, the tool of a walk audit, back to your communities. I thought that it was fruitful in North Kingstown, South Kingstown. They seemed like they were, I mean, check me if you think otherwise, but they seemed like they started discussion in a way that I don't think happens if you just look at pictures and look at maps and have these kinds of arguments. Here are my 3 rules for the walk audit, so don't get up yet, and then we'll just convene outside. and you can add, but my 3 rules. Rule number 1, be careful. We're not just looking at slides, we're out in the real world. Don't just cross the street because the person in front of you did. Look out for one another, cross carefully. Seriously, keep your head on a swivel, because this is some fast-moving traffic, to Mary's point. 2, think about all potential users, not just those of us represented here. What would it be like for somebody who's visually impaired or blind? What would it be like for somebody who's pulling a grocery cart or pushing a stroller? Somebody who's 7 years old, 77 years old, sort of any assistive devices. Just think about all those possible users in the environment. Don't just think about how it works for you. 3, using a cane. Okay, yes, thank you. 3, I want you to score it on a score of 0 to 10 as we're walking, 0 to 10 of stickiness. 10, super sticky, wow, this would encourage me to walk all the time. 0, horrible, I would never walk here. And that number will probably vary over parts of the walk, so we'll check in once or twice. But be thinking of your score. I've found it an effective conversation starting tool. So use that. As we're walking, be talking to one another about why your score is what it is. Questions, comments, additions, send us off, Chief. What else do we need?
Well,
On the tour, because what's going to happen is we're actually not going to be able to make our way around. We've got the 45 minutes on the tail end.
Are we going doing the circulator road too?
That's the plan, but it may end up getting somewhat abbreviated. So we have vests. Before we get up and get the vests, and we'll bring the vests out. Wow, that was a terrific presentation.